Tracking the Tennessee Transition. On Wednesday, December 16th, 2020, I loaded up with 2 guitars and a folder of lyrics before heading across town to spend a day in the studio recording a set of 13 songs, all live with just 2 microphones and a couple of video cameras to capture the results. The intention was to take songs from both halves of my Clovis Limit duology and reimagine them from a solo perspective. I mean, for the most part, this is how I write songs anyway, just a guitar and a voice. So it's relatively straightforward for me to strip back the production to the point where you're left with the purest version of the song. Sitting, as it does, midway between the rootsy Americana of Clovis 1 and the more urgent Southern rock of Part 2, the Tennessee Transition is about the most authentic representation of me as a singer and guitarist that I could offer. The idea also fits very well into the alternate reality theme that I like to play around with when switching from one musical style to another. What I've ended up with is 4 songs from each Clovis Limit record, plus a version of my song Fixin' to Die, which was originally on the Spindrift album of mine, and a few pre-war Delta blues tracks from Blind Willie Mctell, Charlie Patton and Booker White. I guess I wanted to have a companion work to my 2 Clovis albums, something that would give the listener a bit of an idea as to what influences me as a writer and a solo performer, and I think the finished product illustrates that very well. I had originally planned to head back out to the US to film and record this session, but of course COVID had other plans, so I ended up back at Electric Studios in Brighton, a place I frequent a lot as it happens, seeing as it was the studio where the majority of the basic tracks on Clovis 2 were recorded, as well as RHR's first album, Mahogany Drift.
Well, it's obviously not easy, but...
To be truthful, Memphis would have been my preferred location, as that city seems to contain all the seeds and roots of the music that I love the most, be it acoustic country blues or the roots of rock and roll and rockabilly originating out of Sun Studios, or the gut-wrenching soul music of Stax from across town. That's where the idea for the name The Tennessee Transition came from, really. Still, working close to home certainly had its advantages, as I was able to call on the services of Al Scott in the production and engineering department, as well as filming assistance from Neil Collins, who is another local collaborator of mine. The recording session itself was actually pretty gruelling, personally. I think partly it was because it was such an exposed thing, arrangement-wise, with just the guitar and voice, and also because there were multiple cameras mercilessly capturing every mistake. Every grunt, every forgotten word, every bum note or slide rattling down the fretboard was faithfully recorded. Although I wrote most of the songs on acoustic guitar, the arrangements on Tennessee Transition are pretty different, and the combined fretted and slide style of guitar playing is pretty intense, especially when I'm singing the way I like to, i.e. varying the melody as I go, being influenced by what's coming out of the guitar and so on. It's real seat of the pants stuff, despite however much effort I put into the pre-production, rehearsing and so on. I actually spent a really uncommonly large amount of time on this material before the session, particularly the slide arrangements of songs like Young Man and Grow in Your Garden, as they differ greatly from how I play the guitar in standard tuning, either solo or with the band. We went for a very simple production style, with just a couple of vintage ribbon mics in the room and very little in the way of processing, just some compression and a lick of tape delay on the vocal, so we ended up with a really honest and organic sound. The guitar and the vocal weave intricately around each other, handing melodies back and forth. It's a very different experience to say heading up a 6-piece band, as I did on the Clovis 2 album launch. Having the firm bedrock and bass and drums plus organ and 2 additional vocals gives me a much more secure feeling, but there's definitely a reward in leaving all of that behind and trusting in the strength of the songs themselves to carry the message, rather than relying on embellished arrangements. As the finished video shows, I'm a bit subdued in between takes, as I'm trying to keep the concentration up. In fact, I often look a bit unhappy with what's coming out, but actually once the mics and cameras were off, I was really pleased and relieved to find that we'd managed to capture exactly what I'd hoped, a really authentic performance. One of the most special things about the session for me was to use a couple of my oldest guitars, as they work really well for this material. I have a treasured Gibson LG1 from from the mid-1950s that I've owned for a really long time, but which isn't that versatile, so it doesn't see a lot of use. It works great for solo blues and country though. Indeed, it was on guitars just like it that the roots of what people now call Americana music today were first laid out on. I also have a Regal Resonator guitar that I bought at age 16. It's probably the guitar I've had the longest, and it's been a joy to hear and see that guitar on this record. They both feel like extensions of my body, I suppose, so I don't see how much more stripped back or raw you could get. When I'm performing material this stripped back, then the basic sound of the guitar becomes much more important. Even choosing which slide I used on a particular track made a big difference to the finished recording. I also used, I think, 8 tunings over the 12 songs, and that's quite a lot to think about on top of all the singing. Actually, when I think about it, part of the idea for this album came about after listening to the song Shake 'Em On Down by Booker White and becoming a bit obsessed with the idea of recording a version myself. It's such a powerful song and it's been done in all kinds of styles over the years. In fact, it was recorded more than once even by Booker himself. In the version that I put together for Tennessee Transition, I've kind of combined both of the Booker versions I know, the accompaniment of the latter one to the lyrics of the older recording. Another Delta bluesman that I wanted to acknowledge in this set was Charlie Patton. He was well known for being a bit of a guitar showman in his day, and he's one of the early superstars of the Mississippi blues scene, travelling all over the Delta to play shows. If you listen beyond the poor quality of many of the recordings of his that survive today, most of which originate from 1960s tapings of earlier 78s themselves, as the original master tapes were sold off for scrap during the Depression, then it's not difficult to see where later electric blues and rock and roll comes from. Screamin' and Hollerin' the Blues is one of my favourites of his songs. It has a driving beat delivered in an unusual for these days number of bars that really jogs your ear and keeps you listening to the story. It's a shame that so much modern blues has sadly been confined to 12 bars of strict 4/4 time. The true Delta pioneers knew no such constrictions, and their music was all the better for it as far as I'm concerned. The last tune I chose to cover is a version of Blind Willie Mctell's Statesboro Blues, which was a song I originally heard on an Allman Brothers record, before backtracking to the Blind Willie original by way of Taj Mahal. It's one of the blues songs I've loved and played the longest, having originally worked out my own version on that same Regal guitar back in the early 90s. One musician whose work doesn't feature on this album is Robert Johnson's. He's been a huge influence on my playing and singing for certain, but having released a song of his a couple of years ago, Stones in My Passway, I thought I'd stick with some of my other Delta favourites this time out. His voice and playing can almost be heard behind versions of my songs such as Blow Away and Driftwood though, so he's well represented on the Tennessee Transition. At the heart of pretty much every song I've ever written, you'll find a guy with an acoustic guitar simply playing and singing his heart out. He'll most likely be sitting on his own in the corner of a shady room, lost in his own thoughts and trying to channel the spirits of the greats, from Charlie Patton to Robert Johnson, Hank Williams to Graham Parsons. I'm not sure I've ever put a more authentic representation of myself out on record.